So when I come across readings like our first today and the psalm along with it, I almost wish I could move them to a particular day. I feel like these readings are perfect for Mother's Day, right? The first reading is what scholars would call an acrostic poem. And I'm sure all of you already know what that is, right? But an acrostic poem, each verse begins sequentially with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So it begins with the first aleph, and it ends with the last letter, tau. And in the Bible, these acrostic poems, what they symbolize, what they express, is a sense of completeness. It's like the Bible is saying, this is the comprehensive and complete description of an ideal woman, wife, and mother. But when we read this passage maybe 2,000 years later, right, we might kind of laugh at that. Is the concept of woman easily just one who obtains wool and flax? However, there's something lying under the surface. The adjectives that this poem uses to describe the woman, like good or worthy, are actually better translated as valor or nobility. They are the same adjectives that in other biblical contexts describe heroic warriors. So when we add this to the fact that throughout this book, the book of Proverbs, the imagery and language that's used to personify wisdom are also used to describe women, we discover something. The one who fully embodies the attributes of wisdom, it's not someone famous like David or Moses, but it's the valiant wife and mother who rarely, if ever, gets a word of praise. And when a woman truly lives these values out, she becomes, as the psalm says, a fruitful vine, one who is the source of nourishment for her family. And so if we look at it like that, I don't think it's a stretch then to connect this with the second chapter of Genesis, where it says that the man will leave his father and mother. And literally in the Hebrew, it says he will cleave himself to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. It's as if the man becomes a transplant and is grafted onto his wife, the fruitful vine, who becomes his source of nourishment. That's incredible. That is how the church authentically understands women, their feminine genius, as St. Pope John Paul II put it. Valiant, courageous, fruitful, giving, the source of blessing to every man who is worthy enough to find and marry one. That is the vision that we as the church want to share with the world. However, there is another competing vision of women. We saw that vision etched into law recently when 2.1 million voters in the state of Ohio, 57% of all voters, voted for issue 1. And when they did so, they unfortunately rejected this vision, because our state has opted instead to affirm a vision of women that is completely reductive in nature. It's a reduction of women to simply two values: autonomy and freedom. And this isn't new. This follows the overall revisioning of women that began in the 60s and the 70s. And unfortunately, this vision has only resulted in heartache and tragedy, particularly for women. Motherhood and marriage were rebranded as a sort of slavery, as an indentured servitude to husband and children. And that, according to society, is an attack on autonomy and freedom. But the only thing those things have gained for women in this election was further enslavement, this time to themselves. It takes women from being those valiant, noble wives and mothers, the source of nourishment for her family that we read about in that first reading, and it transforms them and reduces them into objects. Objects that, ironically, like the third chapter of Genesis points out, will lead them to be used and abused by men. And so we might ask ourselves, how did we allow this to happen? How did we not articulate this vision? A lot of us want to know and are angry. We want to know, who is it to blame? Whose fault is it? Who do we hold accountable for this? Well, there's many people, but let's start with your leaders, the clergy. And that means the person who is looking at you right now. I'm to blame. A priest's job, above all, is to instruct and teach the faith so that you can know what is true, so you can know what is right and what is wrong, and so ultimately, so that you can go to heaven. And my brothers and sisters, we failed you. I failed you. And I am sorry. For 50 years, ever since Roe versus Wade, we've been afraid. We were afraid of preaching on it for decades. Just slide it into an intercession where maybe nobody will hear it. Why? Well, we were afraid of the backlash. We were afraid of losing you, which is ironic given the last 50 years. In 1958, 75% of Catholics went to Mass weekly. Today, 17%. Common sense alone would tell us that when we look at that reality, avoiding these difficult topics or preaching platitudes have gotten us nowhere. We were afraid of women. How are we as celibate men supposed to stand up here, particularly in a church that generally speaking is mostly full of women, and tell you that no, you do not have the right to choose when that choice is murder, when it comes to the human person growing inside of you, that no, it is not your body. It is another body, completely distinct from you. We were afraid. And that fear resulted in 2.1 million people voting to legalize murder in the state of Ohio. Some of them were Catholics, a few, and I pray to God it was only a few, but I know there were a few. They even go to this church. I know because I got the emails complaining that we were preaching on this topic. That fear died on election day. Fear is what got us here, and the truth is the only way out. Some of these truths are going to be hard to hear because we're not used to hearing them directly. So here's the first. If I told you that stove is hot, don't touch it. And along with me, the person who invented the stove said the same thing. And then the person who turned the stove on chimed in. And all of us together looked at you and said, it's hot, don't touch it. Would you touch it? Only a fool would do that. So then how is it that some Catholics somehow knew better than the last 4 popes who spoke on the topic of abortion, than every single bishop in the state of Ohio, and your priests, when all of us together told you that abortion is evil, that it's murder, and that no Catholic whatsoever can support laws for it, including issue 1? So to all of those, and I pray again that there are very few, but to all of those who voted yes on issue 1, I'm speaking directly to you. You have gravely sinned. Please, please, come to confession and repent. And do not receive the Eucharist until you do. Those words can take the oxygen out of a room immediately. We might want to know why. Why would he say that? I say that because how could you receive the body and blood of Christ, who said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven"? How could you consume his body and blood when that vote will directly result in the murder of children? How can you receive that when it destroys that beautiful vision of women that we read about in the first reading? There's no joy in saying that. Heartache, but no joy. But it's true. And I say it for the sake of your soul and for the souls of 2.1 million others who voted for it. I also say it for the vast majority of you who did the right thing, who voted no, because all of you who did so deserve to be validated. You did the right thing. You defended life. More difficult truths are coming. There's no more room in this church for fear anymore. There might be some awkward car rides home. Parents, at times, you might have to answer some difficult questions from questioning children. Some of us might have to have a conversion of heart. There are others of us who might simply want to know why. Why do we believe these things? Maybe they've never clearly been taught. And if that's the case, Father Barry and I are going to help with that. If we need classes on these other topics, we are absolutely going to have them. We're going to do everything we can to teach the faith. There is light, though, at the end of this tunnel. One of the immense goods that's going to come out of so much evil is that now, maybe for the first time in 50 years, we're awake. We know now that there are lines in the sand. We know that we stand for something. Maybe at times we'll have to have some learning going on. That's okay. But what we aren't going to do as a community is, out of fear, go and bury our talent into the sand, as that gospel said. That is no longer an option, because the time for cowardice, for fear, it's over.